In classical metaphysics, existence is often treated as a verb. It is an active force injected into a dormant, inert nature to make it real. We are conducting a strictly philosophical audit of explanatory closure. Our focus is on the internal logic of the deduction, specifically whether the move from dependent beings to a divine donor is epistemically compulsory. Look at this text. This is Thomas Aquinas's actual cause of being project. While popular debates often misread this as an argument for a historical starter gun, his actual project concerns a continuous, sustaining dependence in the present tense. At the center of this mechanics is the essence-existence distinction, what Thomists call actus essendi. Aquinas argues that for all created things, what a thing is, its essence, is distinct from the fact that it is. Existence is not a property native to the object, it is received. Because dependent beings hold existence only by participation, they cannot cause their own actuality. They require a continuous, sustaining causal series, terminating in a being whose very essence is existence, a pure active being, ipsum esse subsistens. Auditing this deduction allows us to determine if this philosophical bridge is an airtight, intellectually forced conclusion or a coherent but optional interpretive overlay. Anytime we ask, why does this exist, we generate an explanatory regress. The challenge is determining what qualifies as a legitimate, final stopping point for that questioning. To test Aquinas' stopping point, we apply the discriminator principle. A theory earns its keep only if it does explanatory work, excluding possibilities, selecting rivals, or compressing primitives. A concept perfectly overlapping a natural universe with new constraints fails these gates. We will test Aquinas against the Changist framework. This model posits a single, ongoing field-in act, structured entirely by internal ontic constraints, requiring no outside components to maintain its own actuality. This introduces scope discipline. A metaphysical claim can be beautifully consistent, but without passing the discriminator filter, it cannot claim evidential dominance over its rivals. If the Thomistic divine donor adds no discriminating constraints over the natural field and act, the deduction loses its status as a necessity. It becomes a terminus label, a dignified name for where the explanation stops, rather than an explanation itself. The intuitive power behind the donation of being argument relies on a specific framing, the question of why there is something rather than nothing. This framing treats existence as a precarious surplus, constantly poised over the threat of absolute non-existence. Framed this way, reality appears to be an anomaly that demands an external rescuer. We apply our first pressure point to this psychological framing, the rule of thin necessity. Absolute nothing is an inadmissible modal concept. A true void destroys the fundamental semantic and epistemic conditions required to even evaluate possibilities. It cannot support truth, falsity, or record-keeping. Because a true void is a logical non-starter, some baseline reality is the necessary default. Existence is the absolute minimum requirement for any coherent modal space. Thin necessity shifts the burden of proof. The argument can no longer lean on the contrast of an absolute void. It must justify the donor role through its own structural mechanics. By eliminating the void as a live option, the demand for a metaphysical donor loses its strongest intuitive pressure. The Thomistic argument must now rely entirely on its structural proofs, rather than existential dread. We must now audit the mechanics of the donor itself, specifically the intelligibility of a role defined as the cause of existence as a whole. We apply the no outside role constraint. This rule states that causal or explanatory roles derive their meaning strictly from within the domain they organize. To posit a cause that sits outside the totality of existence is a category mistake. It is structurally identical to asking what lies north of the North Pole. Psalmists respond by clarifying, God is not spatially outside, nor a competitive event cause. Instead, God is an insulated, sustaining ground of actuality. This defense creates a discriminator challenge, isolating a cause to protect it from being treated like a physical object, simultaneously strips it of its ability to impose concrete, observable constraints on the domain. Once the donor is made completely non-competitive and totally insulated, we are left with an infinite number of identical grounds that perfectly match the observable universe. When a metaphysical cause is defined primarily by its insulation, it produces no structural exclusions. The concept of a sustaining cause remains a terminus label, a name for the end of the chain, rather than an explanation of it. We arrive at the core of the bridge, the premise that if a being is composite, meaning its essence doesn't include its existence, it must receive its active being from another source. This premise relies on a specific starting point, a bifurcation between structure and actuality. This linear model represents the Thomistic per se series. Here, dependent parts require an absolutely independent terminus, separate from the parts, to ground the whole chain. The Changist model rejects this bifurcation. At bedrock, reality does not separate structure and actuality. Existence is not an empty bucket waiting to be filled with being. Under this model, existence is the ongoing, active field in act. Objects and patterns are not empty essences. They are stabilized regimes within that constant activity. This reveals the alternative to linear dependence, internal, constraint-based dependence. In this arch and keystone model, identities and powers are fixed by a co-determination structure. Support is distributed across the entire configuration. It requires no separate anchor outside the system to hold it up. In this network, dependence is the default mode of existence. It is a structural feature of the field, rather than a defect requiring a supernatural exception. A Thomist will counter that structural constraints don't explain why there is actuality, but that objection merely restates the initial assumption that structure and act are ontologically separable. The necessity of the divine donor depends on which model of dependence we adopt at the start. If we assume a linear, bifurcated reality, the deduction holds, but if reality is a mutual constraint network, the donor becomes an optional addition rather than a logical requirement. Under strict discriminator constraints, the bridge from dependent beings to a divine donor is one possible completion of the data, but it is not the only one. Contemporary Thomists often expand the package to find firmer footing. They argue that God is required not just to sustain existence, but to explain why the universe is governed by its specific laws. This expansion faces the law selection dilemma. If God can arbitrarily will any laws, saying God did it explains nothing about why we have these specific laws. If laws flow necessarily from God's nature, we face a necessitarian collapse where the universe could not be otherwise. Dissensus invoking divine wisdom or teleology to guide the selection only work if they provide concrete, exclusive modal constraints. Without those, they remain honorific labels blessing the status quo. When Thomism adds these auxiliary commitments to achieve discrimination, it moves the goalposts. It abandons the pure existence argument and opens new debates in metaethics and modal logic. The cumulative effect of the Changist undercutters is a repositioning of the argument. Thin necessity removes the abyss. Role discipline blocks outside causes. Rejection of bifurcation enables mutual dependence. Aquinas' cause of being project remains a deep interpretive completion of reality, but it has now been reclassified. The Thomistic bridge is a coherent and spiritually fertile way to view the world, but it remains an overlay, a way of reading the text rather than a mandatory fact of the text. The ultimate disagreement is a clash between two different philosophical postures regarding how we satisfy the human desire for an explanation. On one side is closure by posit, the craving to project a single, independent exception to terminate our questioning. On the other is closure by audit, which seeks completion through the field's own internal constraints. If we adhere to strict methodological parsimony, the lawful field in act provides its own internal closure. The demand for an external donor of being is a conceptual projection, not a logical necessity.